Good afternoon, everyone. This is Knut Rostad, president of the Institute for the Fiduciary Standard. It is October 2nd, and we are beginning our final Fiduciary September program. And in some ways, this is a very fortunate moment to have this topic of bipartisanship as the backdrop of this in Washington is demonstrating to the world the need for greater bipartisanship. Not to put any more pressure on you, Emerson, to carry that flag. But so today we have two excellent individuals to speak on different aspects of the topic. First is Emerson Sprick. Emerson is the Director of Retirement Policy and Labor Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. His expertise includes Social Security and social insurance programs, retirement, financial security policy, and labor market. Emerson closely works with members of both parties and is a trusted expert on policy for policymakers on Capitol Hill. He speaks about these topics routinely and is cited in the major media on them. So welcome, Emerson. Also joining us today is Lisa Gomez. Lisa is most recently the until earlier this year the Assistant Secretary of Labor for Employee Benefits Security at the United States Department of Labor. Prior, she has spent 3 decades working in the employee benefits and fiduciary law and workplace policy areas. So we've got two outstanding speakers. I will open up with some general comments about. Well, no, actually, I'm going to change the order here. I'm going to ask Emerson to open up on comments about the Bipartisan Policy Center and what that really means to people that may not be paying attention. And apparently a lot of people are not paying attention to bipartisan policy these days, unfortunately, but what that means. So, and then Emerson will hand the baton to Lisa, and then I'll follow with some opening comments and then open up the discussion to questions and commentary. So, Emerson, you're on.
That's great. Thanks, Knut. Appreciate you inviting me. Everyone on is a friend of BPC, so happy to give a quick overview. The Bipartisan Policy Center has been working on retirement policy for a decade now, if not more. And what's really important about retirement policy, what really makes me feel fortunate to work in the policy area, is that it is a veritable hotbed of bipartisanship on Capitol Hill in an era in which there's not a whole lot of bipartisanship on different policy issues. Secure Act and Secure 2.0 were both passed on bipartisan basis. And, I think that extends to questions around the fiduciary standard, around alternative assets and 401ks. There is bipartisan agreement that there's work to be done in kind of the direction of travel here. But there are questions in how things like this are implemented. And so I'm pleased to be able to have a conversation with you and Lisa as at BPC. We are still very much in kind of the question asking phase about alternatives, in particular private investments in 401ks, and looking forward to talking through the implications of that with you two. So I'll turn it over to Lisa.
Thank you, Emerson.
Yes. So hi everyone. Thanks so much, Emerson, and thank you, Knut, too, for having me join in the extended Fiduciary September. Now that we're October 2nd, but the weather still feels like it's kind of August some days. Yeah, I had the distinct honor to serve as the Assistant Secretary of labor for employee benefit security for the latter half of the Biden administration. And as many of you who have met me previously know, this was my first foray into working in government and in DC and being part of, any of this and coming into all of this as, a lawyer, but as a mediator at heart and someone who is constantly, probably to a fault, trying to find common ground and find solutions to problems. Was very much a challenge in that experience, but I am also a stubborn New York, New Jersey girl, so I refuse to give up on these things. And I have been talking with several people, both while I was in my role and since I've left, about the need for truly bipartisan solutions. Yeah, another Jersey girl, so yeah. But for truly bipartisan solutions, it seems to me that I heard it quite often about having to, not having to work together, but people wanting to work together to achieve certain goals and, bipartisan support for this or for that. But then, in digging deep, often I would be disappointed to see that there was not what I felt was a true commitment to bipartisan solutions, where I think, there definitely can and should be. And particularly now, as I'm out of this role and I'm, continuing to talk with folks, one topic or problem that I keep hearing coming up is, the swing of the pendulum and how, things swung in one direction with, one administration and then back and then swinging forward and, back and forth, and how things happened, during the most recent administration with the Biden administration and now in the Trump administration, whether we're talking about crypto or private equity or, lots of different things, just moving back and forth. And for me, I mean, I can watch tennis and watch something that's much more exciting to watch, things going back and forth, on a screen or in life. And as someone who counseled plan sponsors, and I think we can all attest to this, that it just, quite frankly, gets tiring to watch like the extreme back and forth swinging of this pendulum. And particularly for plan sponsors who, if we're talking about high road plan sponsors, people who plan fiduciaries, people who are trying to do the right thing. What's the right thing in 2025? Particularly when we're talking about investments or changes to plans or, legislation, what have you, by the time you implement it and, get things in place, it could very well be that we're in another administration, or at least that, the makeup of Congress has changed. Something has changed. And now what was previously okay is not okay anymore. And then you're, swinging back on the other end, and there's just so much time spent on that swing back and forth that I wish that we could try to devote some time to just thinking about truly bipartisan solutions. And I just yesterday was in DC and was seeing people from the Republican Party at an event, and we get along just fine, and we can disagree on things, but we should be able to find, common ground. So, and I applaud the Bipartisan Policy Center because, it's right in your name that you're dedicated to that. And I'm hopeful we can try to find, ways to get there. If it's okay with you, Canu, I was going to just talk a little bit about the fiduciary role, and sort of thoughts on how we can try to think of some bipartisan solution there.
Well, yes, but just within the context of our conversation, I mean, I'd love you to focus on something like, and these are my words, the attributes of what a bipartisan solution looks like based on your perspective. So, I mean, that's where I'd like to sort of see the conversation go, and then let Emerson chime in on what is this situation where bipartisan solutions are most successful? For example, what do those situations look like, or something like that? So anyway,
Yeah,
great.
no, so I can use the fiduciary role sort of as a a case study, or as a sample here. But when I came into the Biden administration, the fiduciary rule, had a almost 15-year history, much back and forth, much, litigation, argument, misunderstanding about what it actually was. And so we, gave another try at trying to come out with something that we had hoped would, we're not really doing things we wouldn't call it bipartisan, but something that would address the concerns that, the courts had about the fiduciary role, and, just come out with something that we hoped would be acceptable to everyone. And kind of this is like the song that never ends, with the fiduciary rule. And, surprise, surprise, that did not happen. We tried and were immediately met with litigation and national stays and all of that. With respect to the fiduciary rule specifically, and just, in answer to your question, Knut, about how this fits in with, or how do we get to bipartisan solutions? And maybe this is just from my, long time of working with labor organizations and being at collective bargaining tables and dealing with, those types of negotiations, also volunteering as a mediator in small claims court where people are, they'll think I'm crazy to compare small claims court in New Jersey to DC sometimes, but there's a lot of the same where it's just people are not talking with each other. And then they're getting to this point where everybody's kind of lost sight of what they were trying to accomplish in the first place. And with the fiduciary role, and just the concept of who is a fiduciary and what, in the context there of providing advice about how to invest your money, and this comes up in all contexts, particularly, now we're talking about private equity, in 401ks. And so the question of who is and is not a fiduciary, when they're giving out that kind of professional advice becomes critical. For this rule, and just like in the spirit of bipartisanship, I know that this is not how things work, but we tried, you have the whole notice and comment period, and people will give their comments, and we would, at the Department of Labor, would interact directly with stakeholders and try to, ultimately come out with a product that we thought, in that particular case, in that particular rule, that we thought addressed the issues that the court had with the 2016 fiduciary rule. Tried to, kind of came back on a number of different things where the court felt that the department had overreached, and, came out with a rule that we thought addressed all of those issues. It's, frustrating to say the least when a court then stays it without addressing like whether we accomplished that goal. Like, did we achieve any of those goals of trying to address the faults in the old rule that the Fifth Circuit, said that we had? And so now we're kind of like back at square one. We'll see what the department ends up doing. I, would have loved to have been able to have a conversation with the entities who were particularly, against the latest version of the fiduciary rule, to find out, like, how did we get it wrong? What should we have done differently? Like, tell us, tell us how we could have done this differently. And I also just wonder, and I've thought about this, not only with the fiduciary rule, but also, we're not talking about health here, but, with the mental health parity rule, can we just have some kind of system where we have everyone in a room and there's an understanding that no one is going to come out of this getting everything you want. Everyone is going to have to make concessions. That's how, when you go to court, you have a settlement conference, something like, I feel like we need those kind of conversations, when it's coming to regulation. I mean, I'm sure that is happening. Well, I shouldn't say, I would think that that's happening on the Hill, but with the with the way things are working currently, I think there's a lot where it's not bipartisan, but something where we can really be sitting down and people are willing to understand that they can't have everything the way they want it on either side. And so how can we come to a medium area where we are achieving the goal of having, again, within the context of the fiduciary rule, having individuals be protected and understand when they're dealing with a professional, what duties, what that person gets out of it, what duties that person owes to them, just like where they stand with that person. Because right now, people just don't have that education. So, my idea of, I don't know where, like in the Francis Perkins building, they will have this, place where they just send people who are being unable to get to a bipartisan solution, somewhere, and they'll just like put you in a room somewhere and you can't come out until you've solved it. But I feel like, it's as good of a suggestion as any these days. But I think the biggest thing is, I was hearing time and time again, people saying, we don't really care what the rule is. We just want a rule. We need clarity. And then when you try to give clarity, unless it's the clarity that someone wanted, it's rejected. And so we've lost that aspect of, I think, being able to give, a little to achieve the broader goals. But I'm sure the Bipartisan Policy Center has figured out exactly what we all need to be doing to figure that out. So
yeah, for sure. We've got everything solved, as you can tell by the fact that the government is really functioning extraordinarily well right now on
particularly today. Yes.
Particularly for the past 2 days. Yeah. I'll say it's a shame that the fiduciary rulemaking, excuse me, has gotten caught up in partisanship, but it has. And so in my mind, if we're thinking about the optimal structures for bipartisan policymaking, it is in Congress, you know, legislation going through regular order. That's where bipartisanship functions best. I don't think there's a world in which regulations and rulemaking and administrative action can be bipartisan. The best case scenario there is that it's nonpartisan, it's technical, it's bureaucratic, that Congress has done its job and directed the agencies in a way that provides them enough flexibility to implement the laws, but enough clarity about what Congress in a bipartisan way meant that, future administrations aren't tempted to go back and revisit that rulemaking. When we have things like the fiduciary rule that have gotten caught up, I think, unreasonably in partisanship, there's no more room for that kind of productive policymaking, I don't think. And so I think the best case scenario for something like this is that over time, like it gets whittled down to something that works for everyone in a way that's kind of cobbled together. I don't think there's a whole lot of optimism. Rather, I'll say I don't have a whole lot of optimism that in the short run, we're going to get to something like Lisa was describing, which is how things should be.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you say what Lisa was describing, and to put you on the spot just for a moment, Emerson, does that mean that, that there will be a room such where people will be put into and they will be locked and they'll be told that, they can't come out unless there's a medical emergency or they come to an agreement?
Yeah.
I say that only partially tongue in cheek to say that, what are the, are there any levers? Are there any levers outside of, the individual members of Congress's willingness to talk that can be effectively used?
That'd be excellent. I think we should have a conclave for the annual
Yeah.
appropriations process.
That would be awesome. If
That
I
would
get
be
only,
excellent.
but only if I get to, only if I get to be the one that lets the smoke out of,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Capitol building when they finally come to an
Lisa,
agreement.
I nominate you for the smoke signal
The
job.
smoke signal person. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Works for the works to pick the Pope, so
I bet it wouldn't have to be Senate confirmed, I'll be honest.
yeah, that's
Um, so look, I think there are, BPC has recommended kind of structural changes in the past, to try to force Congress's hand a little bit within the budgeting and appropriation process. When it comes to run-of-the-mill legislating, like, no, the enforcement mechanism is elections, and Congress has to do their job. And if they don't, then constituents have to hold them accountable for not doing their job. And so, that's happening to some extent, and it's not happening probably to the extent that it should for a wide variety of reasons. And so, from our perspective, when BPC is approaching, Secure 3.0, right, or future retirement security legislation, you have to make do with the situation at hand. The situation's harder now than it's been in the past without the leadership of Senators Portman and Cardin. But there are still plenty of members on both sides of the aisle in both chambers that are willing to engage in good faith to promote retirement security. Whether or not revisiting the fiduciary standard and addressing, litigation risk, is part of that effort is an open question. And it depends on whether both the offices themselves and outside stakeholders like us can come up with ideas that can, get out of that partisan muck and garner some bipartisan support.
Okay. I want to shift gears for a moment, unless Lisa, is there anything else you want to add to what Emerson just said? Otherwise, I'll shift gears just for a moment.
yeah, no, feel free to shift
Okay.
gears.
I want to shift gears to what is on the table right now in terms of the efforts to push alternative investments into 401ks, and irrespective of anybody else, anyone on the Hill, I'm curious to see whether there is a sense of what a bipartisan outcome might look like here now. So Emerson, I read your piece on alternative investments in 401ks, and I scratch my head a little bit. I should stop doing that because obviously I've lost some along the way. But I scratch my head because what I don't see is just even a mention of the context of the idea of increasing the accessibility of alternatives in 401ks. That has to do with the F word, and has to do with why are there so few, relatively speaking, alternatives now in these in these accounts and that are being offered, and then the other. So that's one observation. Is the reason why there is as little as there is because there are a lot of professionals within the plans that believe they are not appropriate for the plans because of their fiduciary obligation. Is that the case, or is there something else going on? And then, more specifically, I asked the question, why should someone who is in a plan look at alternatives more in a more friendly way when they are, generally speaking, and I'll see, maybe I want to get agreement here. They are these vehicles are more opaque, they're more costly, they're more illiquid, they're more complex, and they are more risky than the traditional investment choices. So, and then I think part of that context too is we hear the SEC chair talk about being, the SEC and the Department of Labor are in discussions to talk about providing additional guardrails. And, I haven't seen, maybe because it's too early in the process, Lisa, I haven't seen anybody float ideas of additional guardrails. And so I guess I'd like both of you to address those 3 points in terms of the issue right now of alternatives in 401ks, and what does a bipartisan approach look like?
Sure. No, it's an important question. I think it's the question at the top of mind of a lot of folks right now. And primarily, I just accepted your invitation because I'm interested in hearing what Lisa has to say about this, to be honest. But I do have some of my own thoughts. I think, first of all, I think it's important to note that kind of a priori, I don't see any major red flags when it comes to private investments within 401ks. I think that there are practical concerns and questions that need to be answered. But I think a lot of people are approaching this question from the standpoint that private investments are bad, hedge funds are bad. And so they cannot be right for retail investors, and I'm not sure that's true. I haven't seen evidence that that's true. As to why there are so few of these vehicles right now, one, I'd say that industry has been in the past year or 18 months really changing that quickly. But what's important to note is that so to take a step back, 401k investors have access to private investments in their 401ks now. First of all, they've essentially always had access to the alternative assets, as the president listed in his executive order, that are commodities, that are real estate, things like that, right? And so now we're talking about primarily private investments. Vanguard, BlackRock, a few others have created these products to embed private investments into multi-asset class investment vehicles like target date funds. I think the reason that we haven't seen these investments available to retail investors through their 401ks up until now is that those structures haven't existed. Industry didn't make them, and clearly, it is clear, kind of a priori, that kinds of standalone investments that happen in private markets are not right for 401k investors. Like, we should not have the option for 401k investors to dump their entire retirement savings into private debt or into private equity. Like, that doesn't seem like a good idea. But when you talk about complexity and cost structure, I do think that it is also true that equities, public equities, are more complex and more costly than bonds. All of those more complex, more costly than cash. And the reason to allow an expansion of investments into more complex and more costly investments is for the upside potential, rather. There's some evidence, both from industry and from non-industry researchers, that there is real upside potential to allowing folks to allocate a small part of their retirement investments into private investments. And I think it really is just a question of what guardrails are going to exist. Are there going to be caps on the proportion of a portfolio that can be allocated to private investments? What are going to be the requirements related to fee structures, related to liquidity and regular pricing, and related to where these fit into multi-asset class vehicles rather than just as standalone investments? But I'll turn it over to Lisa because I'd like to hear her thoughts.
Okay, Lisa.
Yeah, so I sit in a similar place to Emerson on this, in the sense that I don't think that I don't think that investments in private equity, alternatives, all of these various things are per se horrible, bad idea. We should not be allowing it at all. I do think that, there is so much that is complex in retirement generally. And, in retirement plans, the tax requirements, the investments that one can be in, all of those different things. And, that's one of the reasons why we have people who are fiduciaries who have specific obligations to the participants to provide them with, assistance, advice, looking out for them, making sure, acting in their best interest, all of the above. I think that with respect to private investments and the inclusion of private investments in 401k plans, the bipartisan approach of this should be that we are going to be jointly committed and jointly supportive of the agencies, of the SEC, of the Department of Labor, in rolling this out, that we are going to be committed towards identifying or like recognizing the known issues or the known, flags with respect to these types of investments. And how can we come up with appropriate guardrails that, on the one hand, achieves the goal of trying to, expand the types of, investments that a retirement investor could avail themselves of, but at the same time understands, and recognizes and protects for the types of, areas where the retirement investor may not know, may need additional help, may need additional protection in this area. And, the things that worry me or kept me up at night once the executive order came out, was not necessarily the issue of where the administration is looking to expand access to private investments or to alternative investments, but the language that was being used in the executive order. Not that, average Americans are reading executive orders, I don't think, but, for me in reading it, it is worded very much in a way of, you are missing out. You have been kept away from these types of investments for so long. And we are now, they have been reserved for the ultra wealthy and for public employees. And now we are going to address that inequity by rolling these out, to you as well. And that type of language just instills or, triggers a very emotional response in people, that you feel like, oh my gosh, why haven't this is the cause to all of my problems. I have not been allowed to invest in private investments or in, in alternatives in my 401k. And it's because of that I am, having trouble putting food on the table, which is obviously not the case. But so getting away, so while that language was disappointing to me to read, I'm hopeful that in rolling this out and in implementing this, that the focus can be on education. How do these types of investments particularly work? When are they good? When are they not good for an individual person? What questions should you be asking? Not only as an individual retirement saver, but also as a plan sponsor, as a plan fiduciary. What should you be looking for in the professionals that advise you? Because it may be that, you as a plan sponsor have someone that advises you on investments right now who might be a perfectly fine investment advisor, but doesn't know enough about these types of investments, and is not going to come out and tell you that. But you have to be asking specifically, like, what's their plan? What are their feelings? Like, how should, if we want to look at this, how should we be rolling it out? What type of education should we provide? Like, how can we get more directly involved in, as these investments become more and more complicated, so that we can, help people understand that, there are lots of reasons why this may be, investing in these types of things may be a very bad idea for you, but it might be a good idea for someone else, or it might be a good idea to, like, stick your toe in the water, with some of these things. But I'm concerned that, I was heartened to see the SEC's, statement about needing guardrails and all of that. And I'm hopeful that that is going to be meaningful, in practice. And it's not just we're going to, really take this seriously and make sure that people are protected. But then at the end of the day, whatever comes out is not, in fact, helpful and protective.
Well, there are a couple of things I'd like to jump in on,
Yeah.
both what Emerson and you said, Lisa. I guess what I find very disappointing in the general commentary is that it's not approached with the starting point that because these vehicles are generally more costly, more illiquid, more complex, more opaque, more risky, that message should come across first and foremost. Mm-hmm. That message is being hidden in many, many places, and instead comes across, well, here are the advantages, here are the disadvantages, and then we should let the investors decide. Now, that brings up another, point, Lisa, which you mentioned about education. There's a lot of data out there that suggests that most of this education fails and does not work. And I think we all know it. And so I'm wondering, are we going to go down this road again in terms of guardrails, depending on education, or are we going to actually become serious about it? And no, I hear the words from the SEC, Lisa, but guess what? Let's look what the SEC did with Reg BI. And you don't take my word for it, but go to NASA, the state administrators, and the research they've done in terms of dealing with a key issue which NASA focused on, and that is complex products. And their research in 21 and 23 says the same thing. And you know what it is? It says generally that broker dealers haven't changed very much because due to Reg BI. So I don't think it's unfair to say we shouldn't have a lot of confidence in just assuming that the right thing's going to happen. But in terms of what guardrails are going to come up, I would be interested. How about some serious guardrails? I mean, Lisa, you talk about in some detail with the plan participant looking at these different things and making decisions. And I sit back and say, Lisa, do we remember what David Swenson said about this? David Swenson probably knew more about alternatives than anybody else on the planet until he passed away 4 years ago. Do we remember what he said to retail investors? Don't touch it. Just stick to index funds. Now, was he an old fogey who was locked into the Bogle view of the world and it just hadn't gotten into the 21st century? I don't know, but I do know is that he knows a lot about picking and selecting alternative investments, and he was very clear. So could someone explain to me why in 2025 what David Swenson said is now wrong, should now be discarded?
So Knut, I'm interested because everything that you're saying about private investments is also true about like some of the more complex mutual funds. And
okay.
From an individual perspective, like you can make the argument all you want that people should invest in an index fund that tracks the S&P 500, right? But from a legal and regulatory perspective, I don't see how the argument that you're making applies to private investments in a way that doesn't apply to mutual
No,
funds.
well, no, in fact, to the contrary, I just referenced an example, a concrete example where, where the SEC, does, according to the state administrators, have not done very much to change what their offering is because of Reg BI. And, some of those, I imagine, are complex mutual funds. So no, it's not just a matter of picking on alternative funds. It's a matter of standing back and saying, okay, how are these vehicles different or alike from what we already have? And so, I would like somebody to tell me that I'm wrong about, costly, complex, and being more costly, being more complex, and more illiquid. Tell me that I'm wrong, and then we can start a conversation. But I don't think it's fair to presume that those characterizations are wrong, and just sort of ignore them, because that that is a different situation. But no,
Yeah, but
I'm not ignoring the other complex vehicles out there.
But I also don't think it's fair to assume that those aspects are ruinous of retail investors. And so from a regulatory point of view, I I I I think it'd be really hard to convince almost anyone, and Lisa can speak more to this than I can, but I think it'd be really hard to convince almost any kind of thoughtful regulator that categorically this is an asset class that can never belong in 401ks, because what Dave Swinson said might have been true, but we are not talking about providing the same assets, the same investment opportunities that hedge funds provide, structured the same way to their private clients. We're talking about embedding private investments into multi-asset funds like target date funds, hopefully at a really fairly small allocation level. And that's just a much different question than whether the average Joe should go and be able to invest in a hedge fund.
Okay, let's be clear. I have not advocated that retail investors should never be allowed to get into alternative investments. I have said that relative to the regulatory regimes that we have, the place where there is less room for riskier, more types of investments is in the Department of Labor. I mean, and so, but so just to be clear, I haven't said that none of this should be available at all. But I have said that that we should approach it with a realistic point of view about what they are relative to what the investors are already used to. We should approach it with a realistic point of view about investors' ability to deal with the sales pitches from the industry, and we should do it also from a realistic point of view of what guidance does a plan participant get from a plan sponsor relative to their individual case. And then I would add to that, just as an anecdote, I wonder, and I've asked this to several advisors, have you ever actually met a retirement saver who is totally dependent on their 401k? And so, that to me becomes a relevant question, because it is a totally different deal if you're dealing with someone with several $1 million of assets under management, and they want very much to get a certain amount of alternative investments, and you could say, okay, fine, here, take 3% of the portfolio and go and invest to your heart's content. But that's a different scenario, as Lisa knows very well, compared to a typical 401k saver who is actually reliant on their savings account to have any retirement income. So so I would just like to see that the context of this is more fairly drawn, as opposed to saying, well, there's some pluses and then there's some minuses, and and that and that the investors can sort it out on their own in their own plans. So,
yeah, I mean, I think, I do definitely think that there is, that there are some, there are some specific aspects to these types of investments that are more complicated, more illiquid, more that have all of these kind of warning signs, to it that are just inherent in this type of investment, right? But and that being said, another, I don't know that it's bipartisan versus just, everyone trying to work together on this, but I think one of the problems that we run into is that so often, I feel like the thought of, opening up flexibility, availability of certain things to consumers, to investors, retirement investors in this case, is fought with, like, if there's any kind of indication, not fear mongering, not just real talk about what these things are, how they work, how you may think that, that they are illiquid. This is how they work. This is how long they can take to come out of them. And you may think that you're 30 years old and that, this is a good deal for you to go into this, but you don't know. You can be laid off in 5 years. You want to buy a house. I mean, there are lots of things that you have to take into consideration before making a decision. And it shouldn't be that if we are pointing out, those, I wouldn't call them, faults, or they're just reality of how these things work, that we are now kind of like poo-pooing or discouraging. It's just being truthful and real about how these various things work. I mean, one thing, that you said, Knut, that I think is, one of the things that you said that I think is critically important is this whole idea of education. And this is just another area in which a true commitment to education becomes, continues to be so critical, because you are exactly right in saying that we talk about education, people talk about education, financial wellness programs, all of these various things. But what are they actually doing? I mean, we don't have something where the participant, I'm not, I'll never get another job in Washington again if they find out that I'm advocating for not only, like, people to be locked in a room together, but also for exams in order to progress in your retirement, but something where it's not just, one of these providers, when the private equity executive order came out, said, we're going to ensure that participants have access to education. And my response is, that's not enough to have access to education. I mean, you have to not only have access, have these people able to get education, but we need to be doing more. And you can't force a horse, you can lead the horse to water. You can't force them to drink. However, I think there is a lot of room between the leading the horse to water and forcing them to drink, where we can be doing more to be more, to have plan sponsors, fiduciaries be making, more, and service providers, be making more of a commitment to being transparent, getting information out there, and directly working with, individuals to provide them with this type of education. Because, I mean, I agree with Emerson 100% that, yes, are there specific things about these types of investments that are in ways uniquely complicated, or, have unique kind of characteristics to them that people need to consider? Yes. At the same time, there are lots of things within the retirement ecosystem that are also complex. That doesn't mean that we sit here and say, everything's complex. This is just one more complex thing. Like, participants are going to have to deal with it. That is not, at least that is not where I am at all. This is more of emphasizes more and more that that we have to be finding a way to be working together to have both to make sure that both the people who are offering these plans, the people who are advising the plans, and the people who are benefiting from these plans have, meaningful information, education. And what does that mean? Does that mean, having mandated notices about like how these things work? But, to your point, Knut, like you didn't say this exactly, but I'm sure you would agree with me. You can, how many of us you'd invest in anything? It could be the simplest type of investment, and it comes with like a, miniature phone book about everything about that investment, who's reading it, and if they're reading it, like who's understanding it, or even just a couple page notice. People just are not paying attention. And when when I was at the Department of Labor, one of the things that we did, that was my, favorite part of Secure 2.0, and well, one of my favorites, but, something that I thought was critically important, and sadly, it just did not get the attention that it needed, was the requirement in Secure 2.0 to have more effective reporting and disclosures, effectiveness of reporting and disclosures. And we put out a request for information to the public about how can and should reporting and disclosures be more effective. And what does more effective mean? How do we measure that? What do we do? We got, like, I think maybe, I want to say we got under 10 comments on that. And to me, that is one of the most important things that we should all be thinking about, as part of education. What information are we putting out there? But, I think there needs to be a real strong bipartisan commitment to, thinking about those types of things. And rather than like picking things apart, product by product, or, provider by provider, like how can we meaningfully improve understanding and, education? Because the other part is, and I'm sorry I'm going on, but, the other part is that we just find, people are saying, oh, the numbers are great, and so many employers are offering retirement plans, but the take-up rate is still crummy. And the reason why, part of the reason why, aside from the fact that a lot of people just don't have money to be able to save and don't have that luxury, is that it's scary and it's intimidating. And, to think about retirement in the first place, because what happens after retirement, it's kind of hard to think about those last chapters, but it's complicated, so how do we balance providing more education and, and empowering, plan sponsors, fiduciaries, and most importantly, participants, while at the same time trying to make, this whole system more accessible and understandable?
Very good points. I'll follow up with you, Lisa. There was some good research when the SEC was making their short disclosures that was done. I think it was by CFP Board and Climate Communications, really getting to the nitty gritty of testing certain language that I thought was very helpful, and actually I think addressed what you are talking about. Okay, we are very near the top of the hour. Are there any other questions from anybody else on that would like to that you'd like to bring up right now? Okay, I guess we've solved all the problems. We've answered all the questions. Emerson, do you want a final word?
So the only thing I'd add is that another aspect of this, kind of beyond the regulatory component, is that employers still have to make choices. Plan sponsors still have to make choices about what to include in their plans. And even if they are provided some, relief from fiduciary responsibilities, or rather a concession that, private investments are within, choosing private investments is within their fiduciary responsibility. I do think for the most part, employers want to do, in terms of their plan choices, what's best for plan participants. And so that's just another aspect of this that I think provides a little bit of a break on potentially, potential industry excesses in stuffing 401ks full of private investments. I don't think that'll happen for a variety of reasons, and that's one.
Well, that is good to hear. And although I'll also acknowledge that right now, of course, these vehicles are in they're in the investments that many plan sponsors offer, and of course they are in a place where it's hard to know that they're actually there. I think target date funds is a common place that they're put, and so yeah, the responsibility of the plan sponsor to deal with that, I don't know whether that's within their realm to be able to really get down there and deal with it. But anyway, we are at the top of the hour. I wanna thank Emerson and Lisa for joining us. This was recorded, and I will have it up and out shortly. It'll be up on our website, and I appreciate your time and I appreciate your expertise, and so thank you very much.
Thanks, Knut.
Thanks,
All
Emerson.
right.
Take care.
Bye, Lisa.
Bye-bye.